We're concerned that we may be heading towards a global food crisis, and we think the drivers are different than commonly thought. In particular, there are three popular narratives that we think are misguided, and so we'd like to offer a different perspective as well as sketch out an alternate framework for thinking about investing in a world with elevated food price and availability risks. At a time when global food prices are hitting new highs, it's understandable that there are concerns about the security of global food production. It is often mentioned that Russia and Ukraine account for a quarter of global wheat exports in an ordinary year. And while strictly speaking this is true, the overwhelming majority of that 25% is attributable to Russia, which is not, of course, an active war zone. The reality is, much of the world more or less feeds itself, and exports do not equal production. In an ordinary year, taking wheat, for example, production amounts on a global basis to just shy of 800 million tons. There are, in an ordinary year, again, about 200 to 300 million tons of accumulated inventory. Of this rather large supply, only about 200 million tons is traded internationally on a global basis. Now, in this context, Ukraine's exports, while significant within the context of exports, are not that significant in the context of overall supply. Of course, coming at a time of elevated climate change risks and other just logistical problems associated with the pandemic, the loss of Ukrainian supply is not helpful, but it is not catastrophic in and of itself. So historically, food prices in and of themselves have been neither necessary nor sufficient to trigger regime change and revolution. Taking the case of Egypt and the Middle East today, it is often mentioned in any conversation about food these days that, well, the Arab Spring was supposedly triggered by food prices. The reality is, if you look at the data, the World Bank suggests that actually food insecurity was declining rather than increasing in the years leading up to Mubarak's ouster. And more importantly, when you actually look at the stories and trace the biographies of some of these leading figures in the revolution, you find not starving people that can't figure out how to get their next meal, but rather the stories of, say, Mohammed Bouazizi, who was a small-time entrepreneur, or Wael Gholim, who was a Google employee and leading the revolution from relative comfort in Dubai. So the idea that food prices directly trigger revolution or lead to regime change, to us, is rather overstated and in fact far-fetched. History is littered with cases of severe food crises that do not trigger revolution. We've witnessed them in the 20th century itself, notably in places like Ukraine or Bengal. And oftentimes, it must be said, the lesson from these crises is not that food wasn't available or it wasn't produced in sufficient quantities, but oftentimes it's a story of regulatory failure or policy failure, inept policies, or in some cases, deliberate attempts to use hunger and food as a weapon. And certainly these are the lessons that I think policymakers and investors today should reflect upon. The conventional wisdom has it that from a macroeconomic risk standpoint, as investors, we should be most concerned about the countries that are heavy importers of food. This at first glance seems sensible, but we think it is a rather linear way of thinking about risk in the modern world that is not the most helpful way in terms of actual reality. We would suggest an alternate framework that emphasizes more of a focus on that squeezed middle of poor democracies that are certainly not exporting food, but unlike Egypt, which is the obvious worry for many institutions globally, do not have that attention and implicit support from external backers, including multilateral institutions. This squeezed middle of poor democracies is composed of countries where the consumption basket is heavily weighted towards food, and where the risks of policy slippage, precisely because of that, are very high. The risk here is that governments concerned about winning their next election resort to populist subsidy or tariff regimes that may not be beneficial for the country over the long term. When it comes to the global food supply chain, we are less concerned about the Ukrainian harvest in and of itself. Within the context of Russia and Ukraine, we're more concerned about the unintended consequences of sanctions and self-sanctions on things like potash fertilizer prices or ammonia fertilizer prices, which are directly linked to natural gas prices. These are the input costs that are going to hit farmers the world over. What we're really concerned about is climate change. Ultimately, we're seeing, for example, severe heat waves in India, northern India, which is ultimately a country that produces more wheat than Ukraine. And these are the sorts of risks that are not going to change overnight or go away overnight. These could lead to potentially very persistent inflationary pressures globally for some time to come. These are the sorts of risks that we think are underappreciated by the market.